that we're going live.
Welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm just going to give a few minutes for people to enter the room and then I will get started. Right, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session on children and young people's human rights to a healthy ocean, their importance for climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. I am Bernadette Snow, the Deputy Director of the One Ocean Hub, and joining me in hosting the session is Dr. Joe Pitt, the Hub's Project Manager. The One Ocean Hub is an international program of research for sustainable development, working to promote fair and inclusive decision-making for a healthy ocean, whereby people and planet flourish. We bring together coastal people, researchers, decision-makers, society, and international organizations to value and learn from different knowledge systems and voices. We work particularly in a few countries, South Africa, Namibia, Ghana, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands, and we endeavor to share relevant research findings at the regional and international level. The Hub is funded by UK Research and Innovation through the Global Challenges Research Fund, and we are tackling UN Sustainable Development Goals. It is led by the University of Strathclyde, and the Hub gathers around 126 researchers, 21 research partners, and 19 project partner organizations, including UN bodies and programs. In particular, we would like to welcome you to this roundtable. It is bringing together youth representatives and researchers from different disciplines on children and youth's views on the values of the ocean and climate change. The different presentations and statements will reflect on the relevance of the ocean for climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. The panel will share with you, and we hope through your engagement, we will also reflect on different knowledge systems, including indigenous and local knowledge, and questions related to the integration of these different knowledge systems in oceans and climate literacy and education. It is my pleasure to introduce these speakers to you, and please bear with me as I will introduce the whole panel and allow the interventions and presentations to flow from there onwards. There will be an open session on discussion, so please do pose these in the question and answer function or in the chat function. The first speaker that I would love to introduce to you is Mr. Mark Haver. He is the chair of the Youth Policy Advisory Council of Sustainable Ocean Alliance. He has participated in the Alliance ocean leadership activities for the last 3 years and has been instrumental in the work to develop a global framework for Blue New Deal policies. Our next intervention would be from Ms. Lova Eborn, who is a member of the WWF Sweden Youth, in which they inspire youth and push decision makers to take actions for nature. She is currently studying marine biology in Scotland. Dr. Su-Young Huang is a legal officer with the UN Environment Programme, and she works on the advancement and implementation of environmental rule of law and environmental rights. Prior to joining UNEP, she worked with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, working on economic, social, and environmental issues. She holds a PhD in international relations, specializing in states' compliance with international law and norms. Ms. Lindsey Brown is a researcher in the Marine Social Sciences Research Unit at the University of Plymouth and a researcher with the One Ocean Hub, and she is seeking to find the most effective narrative to engage adults who live in deprived communities with marine conservation. Her background is in children's services and has spent all her life working with children who have been harmed and need protection, and is a champion for the value and necessity of asking for, listening to, and including the voices of children and young people in decisions that affect their lives. Ms. Kelsey Archer-Barnhill made the dive to deep sea ecology for her PhD after researching tropical corals for her master's in tropical ecology and management of natural resources at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. She is a member of the University of Edinburgh's Changing Oceans Research Group, where she studies climate change impacts on cold water corals. Kelsey is a One Ocean Hub early career researcher, I-Atlantic Fellow, and the All Atlantic Ocean Youth Ambassador for the United Kingdom. And finally, Professor Elisa Mulgera is the Professor of Global Environmental Law and the Director of the UKR GCRF One Ocean Hub. She is a member of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governments. She specializes in international, European, and comparative environmental law, with particular focus on the role of international biodiversity and human rights law to ensure inclusive and integrated ocean governance. It is my great pleasure to welcome them to give their presentations and their statements. And as you can see, we have a diverse backgrounds and knowledges that will be shared with you today. Again, a reminder, please do not hesitate to put any questions in the question and answer function or in the chat when we get there. With this, I'd love to hand over to Mark, who's first.
Thank you so much for your warm introduction, Bernie. And I want to thank One Ocean Hub for giving us the space on the last day of COP to be able to elevate youth voices, especially here in the Virtual Ocean Pavilion. I'm excited to share my screen and present to you what is the connection between the ocean, climate, and human rights. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can. We're just waiting for it to get into presentation mode. Still
all
loading.
Right. While it's loading, I can still, awesome. While it's loading, I can definitely still speak on the ocean climate facts. Many people recognize the ocean as covering 70% of our planet, but unfortunately, I think it's funny that it doesn't even encounter 70% of the conversation when it comes to how we can leverage the ocean as an ally in the fight against climate change. The ocean is our planet's main climate regulator, and between our ocean and our seabed, this is our planet's greatest carbon sink. Being able to really determine what are the ways that we can not just regulate the absorption of carbon dioxide from anthropogenic sources, but also recognizing the absorption of excess heat as well. So it really plays a critical role in ensuring that we have mitigation and adaptation to impacts of a changing climate. Especially in regards to the social issues surrounding our oceans, there's more than 2.5 billion people who live within 100 kilometers from a coastline. And when we consider the extreme natural disasters that may occur with a changing climate, this actually will lead to displacement. In fact, more than 200 million climate refugees are expected by mid-century, which can cause significant geopolitical instability and, of course, once again, has significant human rights implications. Not only is it important to think of the ocean and its climate connection, but it's also important to recognize how the ocean is responsible for providing seafood that helps contribute to combating hunger and combating malnutrition. So by ensuring that there is sustainable seafood in the future, we can advance Sustainable Development Goal number 2 to end hunger. And last but not least, when we think about human rights, we must also think about the rights of children and youth, and that includes a call to intergenerational justice. So what are we doing to ensure that youth have a role in being able to build a better future for our ocean? Inspired by the Green New Deal, which was a revolutionary net zero climate policy framework in the United States introduced by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and recognizing how youth have mobilized in these large social movements at the forefront of the climate conversation, we wanted to create a youth-led and stakeholder-driven policy framework of our own for our ocean. So we created the Global Blue New Deal. This is not only our youth-led, stakeholder-driven ocean policy framework, but it includes crowdsourced youth priorities from all over the world on what they thought would be part of the solutions to create not just a healthy ocean, but also a just future, addressing the human rights intersection with a changing ocean and a changing climate. Our Global Blue New Deal seeks to be proposed to governments on all different types of scales for amplification and implementation, and also seeks to advance Sustainable Development Goal action, UN Ocean Decade, and the Sustainable Blue Economy. At COP26, our global Blue New Deal has been instrumental in calling for ocean action. Oceans do not have currently a role in the UNFCCC formal process, which means that ocean-based solutions are not even considered as a climate solution. Fortunately, there is some draft text that has been released over the past couple of days, and there really is a lot of hope for the cautious optimism of being able to include oceans as part of a climate solution. We were able to secure a recurring ocean climate dialogue throughout the UNFCCC every year to ensure that ocean-based solutions are included in our climate action strategy. And that doesn't just happen at the international policy level. Countries' national climate plans with the nationally determined contributions every year will also seek to include ocean-based solutions as well. We must also call for aligned international finance and greater ambition when it comes to reducing emissions and stopping destructive, non-renewable, and unsustainable industries like fossil fuels and deep seabed mining. And just as I mentioned earlier, the seabed actually sequesters up to 25% of the carbon in our ocean, and there's still more research to come understanding its impact. But we're going to open mining of the seabed in 1.5 years potentially with an upcoming meeting of the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica in 2021. I'd be happy to provide a little bit more context at the end so you can understand really what threat this poses to our planet and to climate action. However, when we think about human rights and when we think about youth inclusion, there's only one way that we can ensure that type of equity, and that is through building meaningful participation in decision-making processes. Just last month, the UN Environment Program declared that access to a healthy environment is a human right. Kind of crazy to think that that declaration happened this year, since it seems to be a little bit more intrinsic to not just youth, but I think many people across the world who are dependent on a healthy environment for their livelihoods. And so we must ensure that including youth in decision-making spaces is an accurate way to balance their stake in the future health of the environment and be able to advocate for generations to come as well. I'd now like to thank you all for listening and for elevating youth voices. And I hope that you too can help understand how we can leverage the oceans as part of our best solution and not just fighting climate change, but elevating human rights issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very important presentation and for those insights, and as well as the call to action and solutions that we possibly can start implementing. I hand over now to Sue Young, who is next in our panel presentation.
Thank you. Let me see how I can share my screen. All right, just bear with me for 1 second. Can you see my screen?
We can, if you can just put it in presentation mode.
Okay, great. Is that on full screen now?
Perfect, it's on full screen, we can see it clearly.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much for having me and organizing this amazing meeting. As also Mark mentioned, it's great to have this meeting and have the youth voice added to the COP26. So as introduced, my name is Sue Young. I work with the UN Environment Program, and my work includes environmental rights, especially and one of my really like the work that I really like doing is actually promoting children and youth environmental rights. So today I'll be talking about children and youth and young people's human right to a healthy environment, which also includes a healthy, sustainable ocean. So will share my experience and also share about what's been happening at the global level. And I think also Mark also mentioned a little bit about this landmark decision of the Human Rights Council. So first, please let me start off with introducing you to this UN Human Rights Council Resolution 48/13, which recognizes everyone's right to a healthy environment as a human right. We've waited such a long time for this resolution to be passed, but with this, now we have the UN formally recognize that everybody has this right then including children, youth, and indigenous peoples and everyone. And as you can see in the screen, that's the room of the council where this decision was taken. And it was voted by all members of the Human Rights Council, which is 47. And we had no votes. So we had everyone voting in favor, 43 countries, and those 4 abstentions. But it's really remarkable result that no country actually objected this right. So, and the resolution also notes the efforts of the child and youth that they have really supported this process, and also the rights recognition. And it's really interesting also, you will see in this my presentation, that also recognizes the rights of future generations. So it's not just about the present generations of human rights, but also it's about the future generations, that the climate change and environmental issues could have an impact. And what other things are going on at the global level. And so there is something called the Secretary General's Call to Action for Human Rights. So this is coming from the highest level at the UN. So it comes from the Secretary General, and he launched this initiative last year, February. And one of the key areas that he's focusing is on future generations' rights and climate justice, which include children's rights and youth, and also the future generations. And out of this process, all UN agencies, relevant agencies, are working together, because we have many agencies. So we are working actually under this umbrella all together to promote the youth and children and their rights in the climate justice and also environmental issues. And I don't know how many of you are at COP right now, but you probably have seen I heard actually, so I'm not in Glasgow right now, but I heard actually this declaration of rights of children, youth, and climate action. This was initiated at the last COP25, and we only had about 10 signatories of the states. And now I heard we are getting more and more states supporting this. And this is led by UNICEF and some other governments. But this this declaration is really pledged, drafted by children and youth. So it's not something that is negotiated or that is drafted by adults and just put forward to children and youth, but this is something that's really drafted by the rights holders, which really gives us a lot more significance to this, this declaration. And what other Human Rights Council resolutions are referring to children, youth, and climate change and environmental issues. As you will see, there are a lot, there are quite a lot of it, but namely, there's a climate change resolution, which also had the focus on child rights, and also environmental defenders resolution, which also refers to actually child and youth activists working in environmental areas, and the need to protect them and also empower them. And there's also there's an annual resolution of the Human Rights Council which focuses on child rights, but that one, one of the resolutions had a focus on the healthy environment. So there's quite a lot going on in this area, and there's a growing attention in the past few years on this. And the UN, the treaty bodies, so international law, so there's something called the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and they are also responding to this important issue by developing a general comment on the environment and climate change. So this will be the first ever general comment coming from an international human rights treaty body that is focusing solely on environment and climate change issues. And you see the photo in my presentation, and also the committee on the committee reviewed a petition filed by 16 children around the world to claim that their rights are violated because of climate change and inaction of governments. So that was not admitted by the committee because of the legal issues, because it was because domestic remedies were not exhausted. But at the same time, the committee said this may constitute a human rights violation of children and also the transboundary effects of climate change. So still, it was not admitted, but it's still a very, very important decision. And this shows you how much the global attention is given on this area. And so like all in all this, so I've been working in this area for a few years, and this is sort of a summary of this. So children and youth. And so one is, we all know children, and because their body is growing and everything, they're more vulnerable to environmental degradation and pollution and air pollution and everything else. But at the same time, like they have proven that they're actually agents of change, and they claim their right as a rights holder. You see these photos, there are tens of children who claim their right to a healthy environment in Colombia. So they went to the Constitutional Court, and also their children and youth claiming their right at COP, UNFCCC COP, and also they're claiming their right through the UN treaties. So you see how they're actually being very, very active, and how they're recognized for their for demanding their right and claiming their right. And also another important point is that they sometimes also represent the future generations, because they feel strongly about the intergenerational equity, and also they feel like, no, we need to protect this world for ourselves, but also for the next generation to come. So, and I just have to say that children and youth, they have been really inspirational to make the changes for the negotiations and for adults to make to amend the situations. So just want to thank you for all your work, and also like I'm really impressed with all this, and I commit to continue this work and also integrate children and youth rights in the work that we do, and also do my best to create more space for children and youth to speak out in speak their rights and mind in the environmental space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's really inspiring to see how much work is taking place, and also the opportunities for more activism and work for children and youth and young people. With that, I'd like to hand over to Ms. Lova Yvonne, who will make a statement. Over to you, Lova.
Yes, so thank you. And just to start with, I want to point out that I talk from my perspective as being from Sweden, which is a rich northern country. So there's so many other youth perspectives as well. But so I said, Sweden is a country with a lot of coast where people enjoy spending time in the archipelago, but few people being reliant on it for his livelihood. But yet, I think one of the main challenges is that most youth and people in general only experience the ocean as a water body, and maybe like go fishing or swimming or sailing, but they're still above the surface. And as you probably all here know, the ocean is so much more than the surface of the coast. There's so much life in it. We have the plankton, the sharks, the corals, the octopus, the fish. But for most people, fish is just associated with the salmon on a plate. But we can see that there is a huge interest for the ocean in the youth when we have documentaries such as Blue Planet, which allow the viewers to other parts of the ocean, the open sea, the deep sea, the polar sea, becomes really big. But the ocean is still distant to most people. And even it's fascinating, some people are scared of not knowing what's below the surface, maybe not knowing how to swim, because then the ocean is a dangerous place. So, of course, it's so important to create a bond to oceans and youth, to take them on trip, to allow them to explore a beach, to snorkel if it's possible and see what's below the surface. So, example, if you do it in school or in organization, because right now it is a class issue with access to nature in the Western world. You need the money and you need the knowledge to be able to experience it. And I had the privilege of spending time in the archipelago and the islands every summer growing up. And my parents took me snorkeling, and we did And it was so cool to see the starfish. That really connected to me. And also used to go fishing for crabs. And I have small siblings now. And I see how they also start caring more from the ocean when they get to spend time at the there. When I take my friends to the ocean to go snorkeling, and they all say like how it's a completely different world because they haven't experienced it yet. And one more thing which I think really need to bring forward is the perspective of indigenous people, because they have really powerful stories about their connection and their bond to nature. And that's something which really, improves my bond to nature. So if people will get a closer bond to nature, I think the ocean will be a bigger topic. I think it will be more lifted in the debate. As Mark said, like the ocean is 7% of the earth and takes up so much of the ocean warming, but it's not talked about that much. And I mean, even in Sweden, there are like no major youth group focusing solely on the ocean. I'm not saying that youth doesn't care about the ocean. It's just an issue. We can see small-scale actions such as beach cleans or reducing use plastics, because people clearly understand what it is and it's accessible. But at the bigger scale, it's hard to get active in the conservation for ocean, because where should you start? How can you get active? Because the nature management in general, ocean in particular, it's difficult. And as we share one ocean, it's one shared resource. So it's a complicated management. But there is, of course, a lot of global national youth organizations which try to care for the ocean. And then there are some more general issues which you fight for, which will include and benefit the oceans. For example, ecocide. And ecocide is the criminalization of large-scale environmental destruction. And that would be added to as a crime to International Criminal Court. And what marine examples could be counted in ecocide? We have some forms of industrial fishing, such as deep sea bottom trawling, extensive overfishing, oil spills, such as Deepwater Horizon, and deep sea mining, because these are crimes to nature, but they're not yet crime in a legal approach. So ecocide is addressed in many different EU papers and treaties, both when talking about how to tackle climate crisis, but also to tackle biodiversity crisis. And the hope is that, yes, it's a good thing. It will be able to hold people responsible when there happen ecocide. But the deeper hope in youth is that we will see a change in how we see nature, that before projects starting or actions being made, that the responsible people think, is this legal? And maybe we want to see some projects happening. Because there are unmentionable laws today in society which might be able to regulate some of these, but they are not working. We don't see them being used in a proper extent. So I think we need to get this change in how we see nature. And this also goes hand in hand with support from many youth to the Declaration of Mother Earth's rights. So the mindset of the young people are changing, and we want to take stewardship for protecting nature and oceans in the way we can. For example, by supporting ecocide or doing more beach clean. But if we also manage to create a closer bond to oceans and give youth more knowledge on how to influence ocean management, I am convinced we will see even more actions.
Thank you so much, Lova, for that intervention and for those statements. And I think you've touched on some very key concepts about connection and connecting with and for the ocean. You've spoke about ecocide and also how to support empowerment for contributions in the governance of ocean management. Thank you so much for that. It is my pleasure now to hand over to Ms. Lindsey Brown, who's going to give a presentation for us now.
Thank you very much, Manny. So my name is Lindsey Brown. I'm a researcher with the University of Plymouth Marine Social Science Research Unit, and my background's in children's services. And I've worked with children and young people who've been abused. And in England, there is a statutory requirement under the Children Act 89 to ascertain the wishes and feelings of children and young people and represent their views in decision-making that affects their lives. And I'm honoured to have been invited to contribute to these discussions as a passionate advocate for the imperative to include the voices of the most affected by the impact of the climate crisis on our ocean, and that's our young people. Next slide, please. So if we listen, what are our children and young people telling us about how they're feeling about the climate crisis? Well, they're anxious, they're angry, and they're despondent. These are negative emotions and unhealthy for anyone. But if they persist in children and young people, they are damaging and will impede their ability to learn, build relationships, and enjoy life. Is this what we want for our children? Next slide, please. And how are we responding to these feelings and worries? Well, the primary narrative about children is the deficit model, as described here by GS. Unfinished adults, less rational, experienced, and unable to understand the complexities of decision making. And this prevailing view is illustrated here by comments that have been made about young activists during this conference, the COP26. They should be in school, they should be smacked on the bottom, and they should stay angry. Next slide, please. But this narrative ignores or fails to understand the unique qualities that children and young people bring to discussions regarding their rights to a healthy ocean. Children are fast learners, their brains are like sponges and they're able to absorb complex information and pull things out. They're very creative, they're curious, they ask lots of questions. Children and young people bring a clarity and an authenticity to situations without having been compromised by association, vested interests, and they lack duplicity. But most importantly, they can speak to their lived experience of the impact of rising sea levels and flooding. And it's their future, it's not ours. It is they who have to live with the decisions we make now. Thank you. Next slide. And the results of this inclusivity is better decision making. Decisions are defensible. There's a clear rationale for the decision and it withstands scrutiny. They're accountable. There's a responsibility to explain to those contributing to the discussion why those decisions are made. Decisions are transparent. Everyone understands the process of the decision making and the information that led to that decision. They're sustainable, involving the voices of those most affected by the impact of climate change on the ocean, children and young people, is likely to result in decisions being more accepted and more embraced. And they're future-proofed. Understanding and accepting the impact of the crisis on our children and young people will result in better planning, and they will mean that they can be sustainable and future-proofed. Next slide, please. But this is not about adults shrugging off responsibility onto the next generation. Our children must have the right to enjoy a full childhood, and we must support, enable, and protect them in order that they can develop resilience, which is the very best tool that they will need to survive and thrive and adapt to the challenges ahead. We must exercise intersectionality, seek out the voices of those most affected and least heard. And it is true that many adults find it complex to understand how to incorporate the voice and views of children and young people into decision-making, as they fear a loss of control and status. But my overwhelming practice experience is that it can be done and it must be done. Next slide, please. Children and young people as rights holders must be at the forefront. It is the responsibility of adults to ensure that the views of children and young people are front and centre in decision-making for the protection of the ocean and for climate change adaptation and mitigation. This does involve challenging prevailing culture and prejudice about the role of our youth. However, we need to listen to the voices of those most affected by climate change and who have the most investment in the future. And we need to reposition ourselves as custodians rather than consumers of the ocean. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Lindy. Those were very powerful statements throughout your slides, and I'm looking forward to us discussing some of that as we go forward. And also, recently exploring concepts of eco-grief, which is prevailing lately a lot in many adults, children, and the youth alike. It's quite an interesting concept as well to explore, and the response of even health practitioners in response to supporting people with eco-grief. With that, I would like to hand over to Ms. Kelsey, who is going to give her statement to us. Kelsey, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. The previous speakers have done a great job at sharing how the ocean is so important to the world, and especially to youth. I'm speaking today from my flat in Edinburgh, Scotland. The United Kingdom is an island nation, and yet 1 in 5 children have never set foot on a British beach, and almost half of all children from urban homes have never swam in the sea. How can we expect our youth to grow up and be ocean stewards if they have never even been to the ocean? Well, there is no substitute for real-life coastal experiences. Through science communication and storytelling, we can introduce people, and especially the youth, to the magic and importance of the ocean. This is particularly important for the ones who don't directly see the impacts of the ocean in their daily lives. Sharing our personal ocean stories, especially to the next generation, is a great way to personally connect with and inspire new ocean stakeholders. So here is my ocean story. I'm very passionate about exploring and protecting our ocean. The ocean makes up 70% of the Earth, so if you care about the planet, you have to care about the ocean. It regulates our climate, provides food for billions of people, and hosts rich biodiversity, keeping the seas resilient. Since the ocean is so important, you would think we would know a lot about it, right? Well, did you know we have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of the seafloor? I found out this fact when I was 18 years old, and it inspired me to become a deep sea scientist. Deep sea is the least explored environment on Earth, yet it makes up 60% of our planet, making it the largest ecosystem in the world. There is rich biodiversity in the deep sea, which helps support ecosystem services. Recently, the deep sea even helped us in the fight against COVID-19. An enzyme isolated from a microbe found at a deep sea hydrothermal vent helped develop the COVID PCR test method. And there are more microbes in the deep sea waiting to be found. So how can we protect the oceans when we don't even know what is there? And how can we expect people and youth to feel an ownership over and care about this environment when we know so little about it? This is why I am passionate about deep sea discovery and promoting more opportunities for students to explore the sea in person and through videos when that's the best that we can manage. Getting to see images showing the rich biodiversity of the deep sea is one of my favorite parts about being a marine ecologist. This video shows a cold water coral, Iridogorgia, found at nearly 2,000 meters depth off the coast of Cabo Verde. Before this cruise, which happened earlier this year, we didn't even know the species was present there. Every time we send down a remotely operated vehicle to the seafloor, we learn something new and find ourselves at the forefront of discovery. Thanks to technological advances and the skilled teams of pilots for ROV Luso, we got these gorgeous close-up videos and images of coral polyps. Deep sea is incredibly biodiverse. Here we have the coral Metallogorgia and Anthipathes. There's brittle stars and several species of deep sea sponges. These ecosystems are colorful, rich, and worth protecting. So we need to care and relate to the ocean, all parts of the ocean, including the beautiful deep sea. To fully understand the importance of a healthy ocean, as outlined in the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, we first need to explore our oceans. And to do that, we need funding to keep doing deep sea discovery so we can take stock and safeguard our ocean resources for the next generation. The next time you're at the sea, I hope you can think a bit beyond the coast and imagine what else could be out there in the abyss. Thank you.
Yeah, now click the right button and I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you for bringing the ocean into this virtual room. I think it's an important voice that's been added to the panel, is you speaking on behalf of the ocean and showing us those beautiful images. With that now, I hand over to Elisa, who is our last speaker in the session, and then we will go on to some questions and answers and discussion amongst the panelists. Please, I do ask all attendees to use the question and answer session, or even if you want to put in the chat some questions, or if you want something elaborated or explained a little bit further, we are more than pleased to entertain those in the up and coming session. Thank you, Kelsey. Over to you, Elisa.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all the panelists that have preceded me. We've had conversations in the last week, but also in the past few months separately about the importance of children's rights and youth participation in a healthy ocean. And it's quite incredible to see all our discussions coming here together, but also even further points for reflection and important, I think, inspiration for the One Ocean Hub and others in research, as Kelsey said, from the deep sea ecologists to the social scientists, the lawyers, the artists, who can all support children and adults to ensure respect for children's rights as we deal with very difficult decisions about the ocean. I would only like to share a couple of key points, trying to connect with what the other panelists said, and really stress the importance that children's aspirations, their desire and claims to participate in decisions, these are all backed up by existing international human rights law, as So Young was saying. These are not claims that should be seen as new and something that is additional to what states already are trying to do. These are existing obligations that states already took upon themselves quite some time ago. But the awareness of how important it is now to realize, to fulfill those obligations towards children, particularly in the context of the ocean, has become much clearer, and there's clearly a sense of urgency there. So on behalf of other researchers in the One Ocean Hub, this is really to share how we wish to support this movement, to work together with UN colleagues, with children's movements, with others, in really making the voice of children and youth powerful and meaningful and listened to in all the many international processes that have to do with the ocean. And so maybe just to say from a legal perspective, that would be my contribution, is that, for instance, the point that Mark made at the beginning about the importance of intergenerational equity, this is an issue that we have been discussing since the 70s, but we continue to think about it as a very fluffy concept, indeterminate. But the reality, and this has really been stressed by, for instance, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Professor John Knox, is that intergenerational equity is an international defined legal concept if we think that children are the next generation, and the line between future generations and today's generation shifts every time a baby arrives on the planet. So when we think about intergenerational equity, we already have existing binding international standards on the content of the obligations of states and the procedures, how we go about discussing intergenerational equity. And in fact, children have those internationally recognized human rights to participate in relevant decisions. And those are extensive rights and have interlinked dimensions that have to do with access to information in a timely and accessible manner. They have to do with specific modalities for participating in decisions and thinking about how, as we assess potential impacts of decisions, the impacts that may be specific to children and to their vulnerabilities and long-term exposure to negative impacts on the ocean, that needs to become part of how we generally assess sociocultural and environmental impacts of the decisions we may take on the ocean. And all of these layers of work need to really be genuinely supporting, enabling people, enabling children, and enabling duty bearers to protect children's rights in our decisions and to support the exercise of participation rights. And I think it's really important to reiterate that the pillar of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is that in all actions concerning children, and clearly today we've heard how much children are concerned in the health of the ocean in so many different ways, the best interest of the child should be a primary consideration. Now, in my engagement in several UN processes, I think we're lagging behind in even understanding what the interests of children are in ocean decision-making, climate change, and biodiversity, let alone being ready to make the best interest of children a primary consideration. So we need more work, coming together, alliances, but I think as Lova was saying, bringing together the knowledge that we have available, and as Kelsey was saying, advancing the knowledge that we still need on the ocean to really be able to live up to that obligation of understanding what would be the best interest of the child in our decisions to protect the ocean and use it sustainably. And that really goes to the core of the precautionary principle of the fact that we don't yet know enough about the ocean, its health, and how it links to our well-being on Earth. And so we have to take decisions that advance the science and not allow activities that may prevent us from protecting those best interests in the near future when we'll know more. So I'll stop there and hope that with the question session, we'll be able to go even deeper in those questions, but add my personal commitment, and I think the commitment of the Hub as a whole, to unite as much as we can the efforts across the marine and social sciences, humanities, law, and arts to support children's own aspirations to participate in decision-making and to really support governments and others to fulfill their duties to make the best interest of children the primary consideration in all decisions on the ocean.
Thank you, Elisa. I think that's sort of connected some of the interconnectivity that we need to address and talk about in this session. I do see that there are no questions in the question and answer. I do encourage the audience to ask their questions or raise their hands. However, it is open even within amongst the panelists. If there's anything you'd like to add, any comments on, or any further discussion around some of the points that everyone has raised today, please, you're welcome to also interject and converse around this. I'm trying to see if I can see any hands or anything coming in. All right, then maybe I'll kick off with maybe sort of asking for some opinions. So Kelsey and Nova in particular, you've been involved quite extensively within the COP26 and in the Blue Zone. What are your thoughts and feelings about advancements that are being made in the inclusion of youth and children's rights in the decision-making that's being undertaken right now and the commitments that are being made? So your thoughts and opinions about your experiences over the last 2 weeks. If I can ask Kelsey and Lova, I think it would be really important because you've been on the coalface. Mark, for yourself as well with the different sessions that you've been going to. Kelsey, I can start with you, maybe. Sorry, I'm trying to see everyone as I go along.
Yes, so I was so lucky to get accreditation to attend COP26 in the Blue Zone. And I really was impressed at the amount of diversity in attendees that I saw there. The indigenous people's presence was very strong. There was a lot of women, there was disabled people there, and there was a lot of young people, and not just youth, my peers, I'm talking minors there as well, children. And it was great that we're there. It was great that we were invited and we were in the room. But when youth did speak at events, it was often at a youth-centered event. This is for youth activists. This is how to be a youth ocean advocate. And that's great that those events are happening there. That's a huge step forward. However, youth need to be part of every single conversation, not just on the panels that are solely focused for them. because the negotiators, the people making the decisions, they're not going to have to live with the consequences of decisions made as long as I will. So it's great that we were in the room, but we were in the streets. The youth-led protest has been what's really made the news. The youth know what they want. They understand that we are in a climate emergency, and they have a lot to say, and they're not afraid to say it. So I don't think that people should be afraid to invite us to join panels and speak to the science and show our support that we want action now, and we want to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming alive.
Thank you, Kelsey. And before you, I allow Lova and Mark to respond and give their impressions, there is a question in the chat for you, Kelsey, from Isabel. Do you think your work as a youth ambassador helps to shape awareness for the ocean? And I think in some aspects you've already responded to this a little bit. And in light of the upcoming year of European youth, what would you wish to see happening in that particular year?
Thank you so much for that question, Isabel. I like to think that my work as a youth ambassador helps to share awareness for the ocean. I hope I'm not doing everything for nothing. I'm an All-Atlantic Ocean Youth Ambassador, and this platform has been really great to provide me the opportunity to speak out at events like this. And my fellow ambassadors, which range from countries all across the Atlantic, there are other events speaking there as well. So it's great that there's this youth ambassador platform for us to be able to get into conferences, get into these events and speak. And I'm also just passionate about doing outreach and engagement to the general public and to students, and going into schools and speaking there. It was in a classroom that I became inspired to become a deep sea scientist when I was 18 years old. So I hope that I can at least inspire one person to pursue this career path. And for the Year of European Youth, this is such a big chance, and it's a big chance to also include youth in the ocean, because it's the Year of European Youth, but it's the UN Ocean Decade of Sustainable Development. So I'm really thinking that this is the time for youth activists, and especially youth ocean activists. And within Europe, for the youth in the coming year, it would be great to be able to be seen as stakeholders and not as a nuisance or idealistic, but voters and people who have rights on this planet.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, for that response, and also thank you for the question, and please do post some more questions. And I think what I've heard from your response at this point is, it's great to be there, but you want to participate and contribute in a meaningful way. So that's quite interesting from there. There is another question in the chat for you, Kelsey, but I think I'm going to give Lova and Mark an opportunity, and we'll come back to that unless you would like to answer it in the chat. Lova, can I hand over to you?
Yes, I think Kelsey said really good what the general feeling is here. That's we are invited. Like if you look at the numbers, there is a lot of youth, there is indigenous people. But if you look at who actually has access to negotiating rooms, then it's the most inaccessible COP. So it's good that we, of course, we get possible to come into the blue zone, and I'm so thankful, and to be on panel stages, but it's also a lot of time youth focused. But then there are some great youth delegates, that's good. But even they sometimes experience they don't have the opportunity to properly influence. So I would say we are not in the completely wrong place, but we're far from where we want to be to the really proper inclusion of youth in these processes.
Thank you, Lova, for those comments and supporting what Kelsey has mentioned. And so maybe it's, we can look in terms of our call to action about how we can actually address that, because I think that's a call on real inclusion at the table, the negotiating table, not just invited to particular events itself and sitting on the fringes and seen as being included. based on that. Thank you, Lova. Mark, if you have any comments.
Yeah, I totally agree with the comments made by Kelsey and Lova. I thought you were spot on in saying that, yes, there was a presence there, and I do think that counts for something, but really it's about that meaningful and equitable participation from youth that wasn't there. We weren't included in the negotiations and many delegations, and a lot of countries didn't include youth in their delegations at all. I think that, yes, the conversation needs to expand beyond youth-centric events, because who is the audience for those youth-centric events? Oftentimes youth. And so you're putting youth in this echo chamber that's mobilizing an already mobilized audience. It's great, but it is a little tokenizing at the same time. I think that if we can count on that intergenerational partnership, we're able to develop a benchmark of environmental and climate leaders, as well as ocean leaders, that are really going to be able to lead the charge in the change that we need. I want to give a shout out to some delegations that have included youth in their negotiating parties. I believe it was Malta, Seychelles, Panama, Costa Rica, Liberia, Kenya, and I think I'm forgetting like one or two. But those are countries that are leading the way. In fact, the average age of a negotiator from Panama was between 27 and 29 years old, which is incredible. They actually gave up their last speaking slot during sort of the COP26 plenary session to UNGO, the youth organizing body of NGOs of the UNFCCC. So it's great to see that leadership. But one of the sort of other main problems that we see as youth is that we love to see, these youth come from small island developing states or other countries that maybe have contributed least to global emissions. But if we're not including youth from countries that are really most responsible for causing the climate crisis, then the ambition that we need to actually solve the problem isn't going to be represented. I struggled to find many American youth who were there, period, whether it was and the people that were there were from other NGOs or from American universities. But really, once again, it's that governmental partnership with youth that is going to be critically important. There are some outcomes in COP that will support the inclusion of youth in these spaces. There's a specific top line sort of demand for countries to include youth in the delegations next year and at future COP. We'll see what that actually means, and if that's just going to be like, okay, a couple of you can come, but don't come to the negotiating room. We'll see how that shakes out. But yeah, I totally agree with Lova and Kelsey, and also would like to say that you can also get involved through Sustainable Ocean Alliance as well. And we'll definitely be looking to elevate more youth voices calling for both ocean and climate action, as well as financing projects related to that too.
Thank you, Mark, and echoing, but also giving some solutions and also highlighting some of the other comments that we've heard via, the different social media and in other discussions that we've had, is that the representation within the different rooms are sometimes not necessarily equal, or the power relations or the power dynamics within these rooms, even amongst youth or amongst children, needs to also be reflected on in terms of everyone being able to contribute equally and integrate in. I was wondering if there are any of the other panel members. There are no other questions, and Kelsey has kindly answered the one in the text. If there are any other comments or statements from the other panel members in reaction to what was said by our youth representatives in this session, or in relation to the different presentations that were given. Elisa, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of additional points came to my mind, also from the previous comments that I thought it would be good to share. I mean, I think Lindy made a really important point that governments may be hesitant to engage more youth because they may think, oh, we don't know how to do this. But there are methods that exist that have been tested. And I thought there may be one kind of work that we could do also so young with the UN, and particularly in the context of the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, is collect existing methods and experiences and try to work towards sharing them, both with governments, but also with UN secretariats, so that they can start to see what could be embedded in the processes, and knowing that there is evidence, experience, examples, rather than thinking that they're starting from scratch here. And of course, hopefully moving forwards, there can be comparisons. And, you know, it's often helpful to say, well, how transparent and inclusive is the climate COP compared to, say, the biodiversity COP, or compared to the negotiations and the International Seabed Authority. And this is really one way to try and keep raising the bar. So I think that that's a really important point of action for us to take forward. The second point I wanted to make is kind of expanding a bit more what I was saying about how important it is to point where we're talking about existing obligations for states, things that are not new, but that they have already committed to, although they may not have realized. And I think in that case, for instance, the point about funding, and we know that, you know, the climate COP has been very much about also very difficult negotiations on climate funding, and that may make a difference for the ocean as well. But more generally, there may be funding involved also in ensuring participation of youth and children in future international negotiations. And often states see funding as voluntary, something that those who have the opportunity may choose to do or not. And this, as an international lawyer, I find is a misconception. We have international obligations on funding, and more we are clear that when states don't comply with their obligations to for financial solidarity, there actually are very clear negative impacts on human rights across the world and for particular communities. So we really need to work on that aspect as well, make it very clear that funding is part of the specific obligations on funding, and many other key international obligations rely on that funding being really delivered and addressed to certain priorities. And finally, the whole idea that all of this will require adjustments in terms of the international processes, procedures, in terms of also creating capacity building and appropriate information to support that participation. All of that also should be understood as something that needs to be done, and needs to be done as soon as possible. And again, maybe we can think about how to spell that out in more details, because the more we are clear and provide, I think, concrete steps, the more hopefully we're getting closer to get those steps in place.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you for highlighting. I think what is quite clear is one is a possible approach in terms of the methods to working together and making it accessible, but also highlighting those existing obligations that need to be implemented, and we need to influence accordingly. And I think those were very important in addressing some of the experiences that have been raised by the youth at this moment in time. Before we go on and looking at maybe some of the sort of key messages that are emerging from everyone's presentations today, I was wondering if any of the other panel would like to also maybe comment on what Elisa has added in now, what the youth representatives, there's something you felt you really wanted to say in your presentation, but you didn't. See if there's any hands or any response. Sorry, I don't see any hands, but sometimes if there's a hand somewhere else, just missed it. Mark, yes.
Yeah, I really like what Dr. Morgera had to say about using those sort of different mechanisms that exist already and that have already been vetted by the UN to include youth in those processes. I think you're right, there is sort of that barrier for countries to understand how to engage youth, but I also think that discounts the youth technical ability. There is someone that shares UNGO, and for someone that had a question about how to get involved with the UN program, get involved with the UNGO. It's super easy to get involved with Google UNGO. They have a mailing list. There's no requirement for membership. You just fill out the form and they're taking whatever working groups you'd like, including on ocean. So join us. But even though she is part of UNGO, and even though she's the focal point for the Global South for all youth representing non-governmental organizations, and even though she's participated in negotiations, using Excel sheets, using these very technical processes to sort of participate in negotiations, so many people have told her, you don't have the technical expertise. This is not really where youth can fit into this. And so it's about being able to recognize that youth too can be intelligent and provide a meaningful discourse in these conversations. And I think it's even more tragic to think about how we're, discounting and furthering inequity when it comes to participation of youth from developed countries. Instead, the countries who are most affected by the climate crisis who may contributed the least to it because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the other financial and logistical hurdles that can come with it. There was a member of our Youth Policy Advisory Council from Kenya, and even though she was invited to come to COP, she couldn't find a path here financially. And there have been other members of the council who were also invited to go, but because they didn't have access to both shots of the vaccine or the vaccine alcohol, then they couldn't go. So hopefully, past the pandemic, we're able to sort of rectify those unprecedented, I know it's an overword use, but truly unprecedented barriers for youth to actually participate. I think that creating these formalized processes within and creating a database of sort of how they've been engaged in the past is really helpful and really going to be a good resource for countries who actually do want to include youth.
Thank you, Mark. And I think you highlighted some of the complexities and some of those hidden stories or barriers that we know are there, but we don't necessarily give voice to them. But I think also in terms of what Elisa mentioned, that there are already these obligations in place, and we are identifying that we are violating the right to participation through not finding means and avenues for youth to participate that have been invited, and that there are these state funding or obligations that have been put in place that could have possibly helped with those particular barriers. Obviously, the vaccine rollout is also something that we need to take into consideration, and then as a global citizenry, how do we address that and ensure that there are these other mechanisms for participation that people can get involved in. All right, thank you so much for that additional statement, Mark. Really appreciate it. Let me see. Sue, Lindy, is there anything that you feel you would like to add from your perspectives? Lindy, I know in terms of your we're talking about youth and the rights of the children and to participation, but I think also focusing on our responsibility as the adults in this world. I don't know if you would like to comment a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to do is we need to have a cultural shift. We need to recognize that we need young people at the table, but actually we need to ensure that when they are at the table, that they're not being expected to contribute in the way that everybody else is contributing. So it's not about you need to learn the technology, you need to learn the language that we're speaking. It's about changing the way that we communicate and ensuring that everyone's voices have some legitimacy. And I think that that's going to take some work. I think that there needs to be, whilst there is a mandate for that, actually it's not happening. And I think, I can see that very clearly in the language and the comments that are made about young people. There's quite a lot of patronizing of young people and the way that they feel. And we need to get beyond that because we're running out of time and we're missing opportunities to have voices around the table that can make the real difference. And we need to uphold their rights. So I think that we all have a responsibility to change the way that we view the contributions that young people can make. And I think we need to put pressure on those people that are making the decisions and hold the power to do that. I think that governments, decision makers get very nervous about having young people involved because they think that fundamentally if we invite young people and we listen to what they say, it fundamentally says that as adults and as grown-ups, we don't know what we're doing. And that's the cultural shift we need to make, because it's not that we don't know what we're doing. We do. We need other voices. We need other views. We need other contributions. And for the first time ever, we need to recognize that actually we need to look to the future in a way that I think in the Western world we haven't. I think some indigenous populations have always viewed the environment like that, but actually in the global north we haven't, and we need to start doing that.
Thank you so much for that, Lindy. And I think that's an important consideration. And I think this also plays the role in as we move into some of the call to action that everyone has highlighted in some of their presentations. But also, Elisa, in terms of the One Ocean Hub's response on how we look at different mechanisms. I'm thinking of also some of our previous COP events that we've had in looking at arts-based and also conflict and mediation approaches, and looking at instilling some of these alternative ways of sharing views and expressions and listening to them, which I think came out quite clearly in one of our previous engagements, that it's not only having the voices there, but also making sure we're listening, we're listening to these voices, or understanding the artwork and what the artwork might be telling us, and being able to interpret it in the correct way. In other words, what it is actually saying, not just using our perceptions around it. So thank you for that. Sue Yang, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Bernadette. Just wanted to comment on the remarks that's been made by various panelists and Elisa and everyone. So one on disparity, I think Lova mentioned about disparity among youth and children, which exist. So you'll see like not all children and youth around the world can afford to actually participate in this international meetings and climate COP or biodiversity COP. So we are really aware, and we're trying to see like how we can actually really reduce the disparity among children and youth. So that's not just a financial, but also the language barrier. We've identified the language is a huge issue. Like it's not that everybody speaks English, and so the language, also the access to finance to be able to go, and access to education, in fact, environmental education. So that's another area that the UNEP and the other UN agencies are working together on, because we think environmental education, I know that you probably know a lot more than we do, but also having that as a school curriculum, because CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, actually makes sure that states have obligation to provide education about nature to children under 18. So we are working on that, and also this should not just be like a boring education, but it should be in a way that is enjoyable and also understandable by children, because UN does a lot of reports and would talk, but it's not really a form that is understandable or very friendly to children and youth, because now nobody reads on a paper, and you use smartphones and not even computer. So we are trying to see like how we can also adapt to this. So we're working on environmental rights training for children and youth, different audiences, but for the smartphones as well, with possibly with the different language versions. And just also tap on what Elisa mentioned about the human rights obligations of states. And this is really, really useful because a lot of environmental laws and the environmental commitments does not come with a strong accountability. But human rights mechanism comes with a very strong accountability. So it's your state's obligation to protect everyone from environmental degradation, and not to suffer from human rights violations and abuses caused by environmental issues. That's their obligation, and they are the states have accountability, should be accountable, and also have to provide remedies for any damage that's done. So using human rights mechanism to make sure that the environmental actions are met is I think it's a very effective way of doing things. And a lot of youth and the children, they have done it. As I introduced, they went to the CRC, and they went they went to the court, to claim their right to from the governments. And lastly, I just want to mention about the sharing good practices. I think, Elisa, that's a really, really great point, because actually, like in these meetings, I'm learning a lot about also how youth they engage in these discussions and the good practices of how it can be done. So what we can do is that we will collect this information and also share with the states so that they learn this is possible and this is not potentially dangerous. This is actually like you have to work with youth and children, and they're your partners and the rights holders. So this is, I think, sharing good practices. That's a really, really good point. So I just wanted to just comment on the various really great remarks made by other panelists. So that's it. Back to you, Bernadette. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments, and I think also some practical solutions that are being explored. And I'm looking forward to the opportunities of working together also around some of the practices around environmental education and how it's seen, with or a part of nature, and also what knowledge is being shared in this. In many instances, we think that sharing just the science knowledge in environmental education is important, but it's actually also sharing the voices and experiences of the youth and the children and indigenous and local communities in telling this, of sharing the knowledge and the science from a different perspective. And I think that's often missing from what we call, the definition of environmental education. And I think that's something that research can bring to the table as well from those different experiences. So thank you very much for those statements. We have just less than 15 minutes left, and I'm going to, panelists, sorry, Kelsey, if I missed your one, not coming through, but shared some commitments and actions, and I'm going to share the slide with you. What I would like to do is invite the participants in the chat to also list your commitment or to also list your call to action. But please do put your name and who you may be representing, if it's a youth organization or a UN body or a research group or university. So in the chat, if you can also start listing your actions or your commitment as sitting here in this room from what you've learned and heard. And I'm going to share my screen now with what the panel has shared, and they can obviously add, and I do apologize if I did not capture everyone's commitment properly. So in terms of the call to actions that we've had from the different, you've heard them at the end of these different slides. We have seen that it's important, and Su Young has also mentioned, is the opportunities for children and young people to explore and create the bonds. We also heard Kelsey echo this in her presentation in creating those connections in different ways beyond the coast and the shoreline, but also to the deeper ocean. Amanda, who wasn't able to join us because she has caught up in another session, also called for action to include ecocide more strongly in the laws. And Su Young, I think we can use the human rights agreements more strongly in terms of this possibly going into the future. We also have seen a call for the inclusion and meaningful inclusion of youth and local communities in natural resource management. We've also seen the call to stop seabed mining, and Mark did share in his slides the different mechanisms to support their call. And also from Lindy, there's been, and I'm just going to highlight what's in bold, is a call to all decision makers and those that with influence to strive to ensure that children and young people's voices are legitimized with a place at the table. And I think this is something that so far our youth representatives have not necessarily experienced even at this COP, even though they're there. It's the legitimization that's important. And the second point also from Lindy is that when you are asked to represent or look around, make sure that you know who is or isn't in the room, who is speaking, and seek them out and try and understand alternative views, leave no one behind, be better global citizens than we have, and I think speaking collectively for all of the adults in the room. And then from Sue Young is the commitment, and she did list this very clearly, and I think from the work that in the panel's discussion that you've just shared now with us, Sue Young, is integrate the rights of children and young people in your work and in the work of the UN more broadly. And I know that we will commit to collaborating to achieve this. And then Elisa has spoken about and bringing together and mentioned the role of researchers across multiple disciplines, including humanities and the arts, is to support the genuine participation, that meaning participation of youth, and also to represent the best interests of the child will be a primary consideration when we look at designing and formulating decisions on the ocean. So I would like to open up again. If you have any questions or you want to add your voice to this, please do put this in the chat. We really would like to hear from you and your commitments or your calls to action and who these calls are directed at, and how we can move towards addressing them and actually achieving these. So with that in mind, I see Alana. Hello, Alana has put in her call to action, and I really am encouraging everyone to do that because we will collect them. So importantly, one of the objectives that we are trying through our discussion and through these different presentations is that we would like to use this opportunity, your voices and what you have said. We've only had a couple of questions, but we were hoping that with these commitments in the chat, we would like to feed into the development of a new UN General Comment on the children's and human rights to a healthy environment with a focus on climate change. We'd also like to contribute as a collective of this panel and with the One Ocean Hub on the UN Joint Committee to the Rights of the Children to a Healthy Ocean. All panelists have now provided you, and I've shared with you their calls to action in the last few moments, which I've just shared. And I'm asking you to also add your calls to action so that it can feed into the development of this new UN General Comment on children and human rights. So this is an opportunity to be heard. Thank you. If there are no, I'm now within the last few minutes before we have to close the session. And I need to thank Joe in the background who's collecting and saving the chat. But you may speak. Mark, hand over to you. You're unmuted, so I'm assuming.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wondered if it would be all right if I shared some more information about our seabed mining call to action, because we have a very exciting digital day of action coming up next week, and I want to make sure people know how they can engage in that as well. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And so I know I briefly touched on this, but what's going on with seabed mining? This is an issue that really isn't in the forefront of the climate or ocean conversation, and it's something that is in desperate need of greater awareness. There is a UN regulatory body called the International Seabed Authority that governs regulations, currently the lack thereof, when it comes to commercial mining. And they announced in September, in the middle of Climate Week, that they were going to have an in-person meeting in Jamaica, which is a very high-risk country for COVID, that they were going to vote on deep seabed mining regulations that could open up 50% of the seabed to mining activities, and they let no stakeholders know. This is quite literally a meeting that could decide whether or not in 1.5 years that we are going to cause irreversible damage to our planet's largest carbon sink. Absolute insanity. I think we all recognize that there is a lack of due process here, and that we need to be firm advocates for countries and for other parties to submit formal legal complaints to try and halt this unjust process. We need not just to halt the meeting upcoming next month, but generally we need to stop issuing exploratory licenses and to really adopt a global seabed mining moratorium, because we don't even understand the impacts that can come with deep seabed mining, let alone predict or mitigate what will happen when we do mine our seabed. So with that being said, there are a couple actions that you can take in our campaign. It's the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition and the Oxygen Project. First step, take out your phone. If you're not watching on your phone, if you take your camera and point it at the QR code, it should pop up a hyperlink for you where you can sign our petition for a moratorium. We currently have over 40,000 signatures from all over the world. And we invite you to follow the other QR code to join our digital day of action, and make sure that you follow Sustainable Ocean Alliance and the Oxygen Project to learn about how you too can help us protest in front of the UN, maybe not in person, but digitally next Friday to really try and delay that meeting. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions. And I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. So if anyone has any questions about this campaign or our Global Blue New Deal or Sustainable Ocean Alliance or UNGO, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing that extra, and please do put that in a chat as we now come soon to a close in about 5 minutes time. So I'm going to allow for one more comment if anyone would like to comment or have another question. If not, then I'm going to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the careful, considered inputs around this extremely important conversation that we need to have around human rights generally, and in particularly the intergenerational rights and the rights of children and young people, with inclusion of other Indigenous knowledge around Indigenous peoples as well as local communities. Also in the chat, I would like to invite, it's written in the chat, but you are all invited to continue with the conversation at the Youth for Oceans within the virtual pavilion. I know some of our panelists will be involved with that as well. So please do continue the conversation. I am also inviting you to go within the Ocean Pavilion to the One Ocean Hub stand, go and find out some more information. We do have a representative young emerging researcher standing there virtually at the stand who's willing to answer any questions. And you are also all able to leave your further commitments or calls to action on our chat board. So please, let's keep this conversation going post COP26. That will be my commitment, is that we will keep the conversations going and echo what Elisa has put in the chat. We are here to collaborate and to find meaningful pathways to address the issue of human rights for children and for the youth. Again, thank you so much for your time and your attention. Have a lovely afternoon, morning, evening further, depending on where you are within this virtual world. We are in different time zones, and I look forward to engaging with you all into the future. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you very much. Bye.